frame a story in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, where Jesus interacts with a lawyer. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think," Jesus asked, "was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." This story about the lawyer, and here lawyer in the Jewish sense as a master of the Jewish law, is about someone grappling with the extent of our obligation to other human beings. In this course, we've traveled from our immediate obligation to care for ourselves and healthy self-love and care for our body, out to others and family and community and church and country. And ultimately now we're at the nethermost, the uttermost extremes of our obligation. How far does this neighbor love actually extend? That seems to be what the lawyer wants to know, because he knows that these twin commands to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself are caught up with our deepest, highest obligation to God. But how far does it extend? If I've loved my friends and family, isn't that good enough? Of course, the story seems to highlight how we religious folk often miss the extent of our obligations. You see, it's a priest and a Levite, a Jewish religious leader, like unto the lawyer who passes this suffering, beaten man in the ditch by, but it's a Samaritan who was a foreigner, an alien, a stranger, and not a Jew, who seems to be exactly right in his mercy. So the question on offer today that we must grapple with, that we must ask personally, who is my neighbor? What do we owe strangers, especially strangers in need, those who are poor, those who are suffering, those who are sick, who are maybe not part of our immediate family or our small community or our school or our dorm or maybe not even our country? What do we owe these folks? In this picture of expanding concentric circles of affection and concern that we've been considering as a plot line for neighbor love, we have to wonder, how much do you owe on that outermost ring? And the answer that Jesus fundamentally gives in Luke 10 and all throughout the New Testament is that we owe people a lot. In moral philosophy, there's a distinction between a moral or ethical obligation to do something that is right and something that is supererogatory, or sort of like above and beyond what you're expected to give. But if you give it, you're like a moral saint. So for example, I have a moral obligation to every other human being to give them the truth and to not lie and betray them. But do I have a moral obligation to give food to the hungry person that I encounter walking through the streets, or that I learn about on the internet who lives on the other side of the world. Christianity seems to unsettle this very neat distinction between obligation and supererogatory commitment. To follow Jesus is to examine the very fabric of our sense of what we're obligated to give. The early church knew this. In fact, one response to this telling of the Good Samaritan and Jesus's other encounter with the rich young ruler in the Gospel of Matthew is that to follow Christ is to be very lavish in your generosity, even to the point of giving away your goods for the sake of others. And in the early church, many people followed Jesus's counsel to the rich young ruler to go sell all your possessions and come follow me. Presumably selling and giving all your possessions to those who are in need is implicit in that command. The early church was torn. Is that a command of Christ, or is that a counsel? So they tried to distinguish between a counsel of perfection and a command or requirement of all Christians. And the logic went just like this. If everybody obeys and follows this advice, then aren't we all then back in a position more or less of poverty or rudimentary wealth in which we're all needy? What about those calls to, save up, store up, make good use of your wealth that you find in Proverbs, or that you see exemplified in a King David or an Abraham or something like that? That's a puzzle that the New Testament leaves you with, and that Christians have struggled with for the past 2,000 years. There's secular versions of the same tension in moral philosophy. Famously, the most famous utilitarian philosopher today, Peter Singer at Princeton University, counsels all people living in the developed Western world to give away all of their wealth, all of their income every year, down to the point of a very basic, modest median income. The last I looked, it was $56,000 or $58,000 per year. I think it's more than that now. But he says because a utilitarian is all about maximizing the amount of benefit and well-being and pleasure for the most amount of people, that if you have more than just the basic rudimentary income, you are obligated to give that to other people. That's not based on divine command or anything else other than on utilitarian calculus of harm and benefit for the most amount of people. What's fascinating about the response to that is even in a secular voice, you find the same debate Christians have struggled with throughout the ages, which is if everybody follows this advice, right? No one's rich, no one stores up wealth. What about all the goods that we achieve in our society on the basis of wealth? The achievements of art and artistry, the achievements of beauty, the achievements of leisure required to be able to make art or to learn the liberal arts or to learn any kind of trade or craft. Some of this is premised upon the fact that some have superabundance of wealth and are generous with other people. But if all of that was flattened immediately, wouldn't we live in a much more impoverished world at the level of aesthetics or cultural achievements? The arguments go on, and I invite you into reading Peter Singer's great article, The Singer Solution to World Poverty, which was published in the New York Times. The challenge for Christians has always been, just like we've discussed in this class, is our relationship to the good of wealth and money more about the virtues of good use, using it generously to benefit other people, or the virtue of renunciation, letting go of all of it in one shot to benefit other people and to bring ourselves down? But here, importantly, in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke 10, the question is not abstract and the question is not depersonalized. The question is about taking care of someone who is both sick and suffering and poor and in need. And the question is one of mercy. And the answer, who is my neighbor? The answer to the question, who is my neighbor, is given in the form of this story. Don't you love that? Next time someone asks you a question, try replying by telling a really awesome story or parable, like the Good Samaritan. So what do we owe? Okay, that sounds like fancy footwork. Let's answer the question, who's my neighbor and what do I owe to someone who I don't know, who I just come across on the side of the road, whatever that means metaphorically in our own lives? The answer that Christianity has worked out is that we owe Those suffering in need, whether sick or poor or any other kind of neediness, we owe them what we can offer in terms of physical relief of their suffering, but we also owe them something deeper, which is loving affection and attention to their humanity. Let me unpack that. Certainly, when we encounter the sufferer, the person in need, the sick, part of our obligation is to do what we can, and discerning and determining what we can do is the challenge to help relieve that person's suffering, bring them back to health, and to care for them. But we also owe them something at the level of recognition of their humanness, of their humanity, of their divine image bearingness. What does that mean? It means that all human beings have been made in the image of God, it says in Genesis 1:26 through 28. And that part of what we want to do is to not dehumanize, depersonalize, or categorize those in that condition, but to actually connect with their own humanity in the act of care. So in the Christian tradition, neighbor love for the extreme stranger, the foreigner, the alien, the sick, the poor, the one who's outside of our usual concentric circles, outside the circumference of our own normal friendships and affections, we owe the gift of mercy. And mercy is both about relief, about care, but it's also about respect and reverence and recognition. Love as attention. One of the ways we can think about this love of the stranger, the love of the sick, the love of the poor, is to think about attending to their humanity. Simone Weil, the great French philosopher, wrote, "Not only does the love of God have attention for its substance, but the love of our neighbor, which we know to be the same love, is made of the same substance. Those who are unhappy have no need of anything in this world but people capable of giving them their attention." The capacity to give one's attention to a sufferer is a very rare and difficult thing. It is almost a miracle. It is a miracle. Nearly all those who think they have this capacity do not possess it. Warmth of heart, impulsiveness, pity are not enough. Simone Weil goes on to say that this doesn't clear us of the obligation to actually offer physical help, to relieve the suffering of the sick as a nurse or a physician or just as a friend. It doesn't get us off the hook for offering some of our own surplus of wealth or goods to care for the person in the ditch. But it gets at something much deeper, and that is that love of neighbor is also about seeing the neighbor. Seeing the neighbor. And one of the things we struggle with most in our distracted, fast-paced, oversaturated lives is the simple ability to deliberately look and pay attention to another person. The pity that the Samaritan offers the man in the ditch is both the pity of physical relief of his suffering, but also the pity, the sympathy of seeing his humanity, putting him on his own animal and taking him to the inn. Simone Weil goes on further to say that this true attention to another's humanity, it's not just warmth of heart or pity, but it's recognition that the sufferer exists, not only as a unit in a collection, but as a human being, just like us. Simone Weil goes on further to say that this kind of attention to the suffering neighbor is self-emptying. She says that your soul empties itself of all its own contents in order to receive into itself the being it is looking at, just as he is in all his or her truth. That is, when you encounter the sufferer, the hardest thing to do is to ask them, what are you going through? And there's been much written about this, in which our compassion and our desire to relieve the suffering of others or to help others actually goes desperately astray when we fail to make this important step, which is to recognize the humanity, both the individuality and the particularity, but also the humanity, the likeness to ourselves of the sufferer, and to ask them the question, what are you going through? She tells a story in her essay of the search for the Holy Grail, in which the adventurer finally gets to the Grail and finds a king paralyzed by a deathly disease. And the adventurer asks the king, "What are you going through?" And in that is given the Holy Grail from the king. She says that this is the great task of neighbor love, is to simply turn to the neighbor, especially the one in need, the one suffering, and ask them, "What are you going through?" Now, what does all of this look like for you and for me? Christianity doesn't give any tidy, neat, cut and dried Peter Singer-esque answers about 57 grand per year and the rest going. It doesn't even hang ultimately on the biblical Old Testament tradition of giving 10% of your income pre-tax away, although many Christians subscribe to that part of the Old Testament. The answer is not neat and tidy. The answer is no neater and tidier than Jesus' answer to the lawyer who asked, "Who is my neighbor?" and responds with this harrowing, beautiful tale about a Samaritan who stops after two others pass by. It's ultimately about scouring and searching your own heart, asking, where's your own surplus? Where's your own lack of attention to those in need around you? Where are ways that we can challenge ourselves with generosity to rely more on the goodness of God and more on the gift of giving? Ultimately, at the highest, widest mark of this concentric circling of love that we've been talking about, from self to spouse to city to country to church to out to these communities, the highest and widest mark, we find that God himself has encircled us. God himself in Jesus Christ has come down and brought our humanity into himself. God, who is fully divine, became the person of Jesus Christ, in which humanity and divinity were joined. At its heart of this process of oikeiosis, as we talked about, this hospitality of bringing others closer into the circle of your own self-care and self-concern, is the display of God doing it for us. That's what God has done in Jesus Christ in the incarnation. Now, what that teaches us is that we can follow and imitate Christ in bringing others, especially those who are in need, into the circle of our own concern. Indeed, it says mysteriously that the commands to love God and love neighbor as self have actually been joined and unified, such that loving the neighbor can be a form of loving God, because God has become the neighbor in Jesus Christ, who we've been called to love. What do I mean by that? In Matthew 25, it's a beautiful mega picture of the final judgment, beautiful and also terrifying, in which the gospel writer says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? When was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.' Then he will say to those who are at his left hand, 'You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' Then they will also answer, 'Lord, when was it we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick in prison and didn't take care of you?' Then he will answer, Truly, I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Here the stakes are very high. Eternal destinations are on offer, and something of the final analysis, the final summary of it all, will have to do with how we did or did not respond to those who are in need, those who are thirsty or hungry, strangers or naked or sick or in prison. You sense the surprise of the sheep going into paradise and the surprise of the goats heading into judgment. That insofar as they did or did not do these acts of mercy to the least of these, to those in need, they were actually doing it or not doing it to the King, to Christ himself. That is, our capacity to pay attention to and love those in need around us has everything to do with our eternal destination. How you square that fully with the unmerited free grace of God and the gift of salvation by faith is, of course, one of the challenges of squaring the New Testament ethics and theology. But it's important to remember that in this story we find that we can actually meet God and love God, loving Jesus himself by loving the neighbor in need. Augustine, in one of his famous sermons, 90a, he says this: "We all have neighbors. Reach out now to your neighbor in order to love God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole mind. Oh man, if you do not love the brother or sister whom you can see, how will you be able to love God whom you cannot see?" Yes, you hear the words borrowed from the Apostle John. So that gives us a rule to follow. Let us start from our neighbor in order to arrive at God. Now, this idea of loving God or loving Jesus even in the poor person, in the suffering or the sick person, we ought not be afraid that that actually depersonalizes or dehumanizes them, because in Christ, it's full humanity and full divinity. God has joined the two commands of loving God and loving neighbor in caring for the needy stranger, in the sick friend, in the impoverished. Christians have always had a strong connection to healthcare, and in fact, in many ways, borrowed the Hippocratic tradition from Greece and Rome and gave birth to what we think of as the modern hospital and healthcare system because of God's preferential concern for those who are suffering, those who are sick, those who are on the margins, those who are on outside. Again, there's no cut and dried, tidy definition of what you owe in terms of dollars and cents or in terms of how much time to spend caring about your friends on Instagram versus how many hours at the soup kitchen. It doesn't work that way. But the one thing that should be patently obvious and clear to me reading the New Testament, and I hope to you, is that we have not yet challenged our own sense of what mercy requires. We have not yet extended ourselves out as a church, as Christians, to fully understand the generosity of God toward those in need, which is, of course, us, but it's all around us. We have not yet fully reckoned with the question, who is my neighbor?